My name is Jesse Mark Harris, and this is part one. My Christmas guess and God's Christmas answer, part one. My voice is being stolen from me by fears of going to hell, by fears of not making it to heaven, by fears of getting to heaven and it feeling like hell, by fears of getting to hell and finally understanding what heaven was all about. Fears of being stuck in between, fears of being wrong, fears of being alone, fears of being too much this and too little of that, fears of being weird, fears of being ugly, fears of just being average, fears of being beautiful, fears of being stupid, fears of being imperfect, fears of being unnatural, fears of fitting in and fears of standing out, fears of being anti when I'm supposed to be for, and fears of being for when I'm supposed to be against, fears of being different, fears of not fitting into anyone else's box, fears of only fitting into everyone else's box, fears of there not being any box at all, fears of being all alone in my own box, fears of inconsistency, fears of hypocrisy, fears of imperfection, fears of true humanity, fears of inability, fears of ability beyond imagination, fears of being controlled, fears of doing the controlling, fears of being prideful, fears of being doubtful, fears of being excited, fears of being depressed, fears of feeling and being anything at all, fears of losing, fears of winning too much, fears of winning too fast, fears of losing reality, fears of ceasing to dream beyond reality, fears of death, fears of life, fears of constant death, fears of blasphemy, fears of prophecy, fears of inescaping my own fear of all evil, fears of buying into lies, fears of giving out the lies, fears of repeating the past, fears of relearning old sins and mistakes, fears of future depravity, fears of present rejection, fears of offending others, fears of including others, fears of confusing friends, fears of disappointing family, fears of misleading strangers, fears of making anyone proud of me at all, fears of being the only odd one out, fears of causing all fear, fears of being fear itself, fears of being misunderstood, fears of finally being understood, fears of good things starting and fears of good things ending, fears of unexpected good things being really good, fears of bad things I think are good actually being really bad, fears of disrespecting others, fears of dishonoring myself, fears of being free, fears of serving Satan more than God, fears of forgetting who God is, fears of serving God at the expense of myself, fears of serving others at the expense of God, fears of being served by God at the expense of myself, fears of forgetting what the difference between fear and courage is, fears of being lost, fears of being found, fears of continually being found and lost, fears of forever losing and finding more, fears of never finding more and always losing, fears of finally seeing, fears of letting myself see, fears of going blind again, fears of being blind and seeing at the same time, fears of confusing what's sight and what's blindness, fears of understanding a lot, fears of understanding a little, fears of taking a risk one moment at a time, fears of doing it all at once, fears of simply trying my best, fears of being myself, fears of fears of knowledge and fears of nothing at all, fears of doing and being and seeing nothing at all, fears of the great unknowable unknown, and the greatest fear of who I'm so desperately trying and hoping and guessing and believing to be God. Fear. It's always trying to kill me.